All right, and we're picking up on Chapter 11 of The Ultimate Evil, an investigation of America's most dangerous satanic cult. Blood in the Badlands. I was too young to remember that October day in 1951 when Bobby Thomason hit the dramatic ninth-inning home run that lifted the New York Giants into a stunning come-from-behind pennant win over the Brooklyn Dodgers in one of the most emotional moments in sport history. But through film clips, the past comes to life. The line drive hooking into the Polo Grounds left field stands. Thompson dancing around the bases as players and fans flood the field. Announcer Russ Hodges screaming, "The Giants win the pennant. The Giants win the pennant." It was a Polo Grounds in miniature that roared in my head as I drove from the car home with the treasured plate numbers safely in hand. From the depths of the valley, the pinnacle was suddenly visible through the clouds. It was time to begin stalking John Carr. I immediately contacted Mittigar when we formulated a plan. During the next week, I cruised by the house nightly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the elusive suspect. The strategy was to stick with him if he went out, on the chance he might lead us to others. We also hoped to photograph him from a distance. But by the following Friday, the car, still laden with snow, hadn't moved. Still not discouraged, Jim and I decided to maintain the sporadic surveillance for as long as it took. Since neither Brooklyn or Westchester authorities contacted us again, we returned the favor by not informing either agency that Carr was located. But I'd later learned that the sheriff's department, in the course of the street probe we sparked, noticed the auto too. On Saturday, February 18th, I was preparing breakfast when the phone rang. It was my mother on the line from the family home in Connecticut. "What's new in your little corner of the world?" I asked. "There's something you need to know," she replied. "What is it?" "John Carr is dead." At first I refused to believe it. Then slowly, like an insidious riptide, the realization slapped at my heels, rose up suddenly, and swept me away with a thunderous crescendo. "What the hell? John Carr is dead? How do you know?" The question flew in a staccato burst of confusion and panic. I don't know. There's a little death note in this morning's Westchester paper. It's not a full obituary, just a small paragraph in that column of notices. No detail or anything, just that it happened Thursday in Minot, North Dakota. Dakota? Thursday? It must be somebody else. His car is sitting in the driveway on Warburton Avenue. I've been watching it all week. "No, it's him," she insisted. "Then are you sure it doesn't say he was from North Dakota? He's been out here on and off for years." "It definitely says in Minot, North Dakota. What are you going to do now?" "I don't know. I never would have expected this to happen. I've got to reach Jim. I'll get back to you." Mittigar, in the midst of a lazy Saturday on Staten Island, was astounded, upset, and excited all at once. "He's dead? For 6 months you chase a guy, he lives all these years just fine, and just like that he's gone after we turn him into Brooklyn and Westchester? This is one hell of a development." We then realized we had to learn just what happened to Carr. For all we knew, he had been ill or hit by a bus. Mittigar volunteered to contact the Minot police to find out. A long, nervous hour later, he was back on the phone. Listen to this carefully, 'cause you're not going to believe it. It was violent, gunshot. And they think it's murder, although there's a chance it could be suicide. But they're treating it as a homicide. Either way, the guy is dead violently right in the wake of our handing him over. I was too startled to answer. You know what this means, don't you? Jim prodded. Yes, but for Christ's sake, what a way to find out for sure. If he was murdered and he was Berkowitz's accomplice, that would mean there's someone else out there too, Jim counted. Someone who shut him up. Yes, I agreed. Either somebody caught up with him before we did, or he heard something, freaked out, and knocked himself off. There are no other choices here. Hell no. Hell no. Not with this timing, Jim concurred. And they've got no motive out there. Now we've got to pull all this together and get the story out. With any luck, everyone else will miss that little death notice and nobody knows he's John Wheaties anyway. The Greenberg in Brooklyn will croak over this one. I'm down there watching the guy's car, and he's out in Dakota disappearing from the planet, I said quietly. It just doesn't seem possible. Why the hell is his car in Yonkers? Because he just flew back to Dakota from here the other day. In a hurry, Jim answered. I wonder if I was seen in the driveway. I don't know, but son of a bitch, we're in the middle of the biggest of them all, Jim stated. It took several hours for the import of Carr's death to register fully. On the one hand, it vividly demonstrated the plausibility of my long-held suspicions, but for the first time, the fear factor also surfaced. Some unknown force had likely emerged from the netherworld of the investigation and struck down John Carr. But why now? Had the person heard of our work, and would he look for us next? For months, I'd believed my analysis of the case was accurate, but it was frequently an academic exercise, written reports, interviews, and remote observations and digging. Not anymore. Now the crushing reality of death set in. Moreover, if Carr was in fact slain, there was a conspiracy of at least 3. But how many more? The specter of satanic cult involvement loomed ominously over the investigation. For the next 4 days, we scrambled to tie the story together. On the afternoon of the 20th, I phoned Sal D'Iorio at the sheriff's department to tell him Carr was dead. D'Iorio said he just heard about it and asked what we'd discovered. I briefed him and wanted to know what, in light of our meeting of a month before, he was going to do about the Carr connection. D'Iorio acknowledged that his office was now looking into the occult in Westchester County, but we're not into the Sam case per se. That's someone else's case, he said. D'Iorio was evasive and didn't tell me that his force's inquiry had already widened, but he confirmed that a conversation occurred between his department and the Brooklyn DA. They're not dismissing any of this. But they won't admit it to you, he hinted. I'd later learn there was a significant exchange between Westchester and the Brooklyn prosecution. Meanwhile, implying he was an official investigator, Midigar cultivated a source within OSI, the Air Force Police Agency. OSI was involved in the case because Carr's death occurred in the bedroom of a housing unit on Minot Air Force Base. It always comes back to the military, doesn't it? Carr, it turned out, had left the Air Force 16 months earlier. The home was that of his girlfriend, Linda O'Connor, whose estranged serviceman husband, Craig, had moved off the base. The information we received was sketchy, but we did learn that Carr closely resembled the son of Sam composite drawing released after the Lomino Damasi shooting, and that he owned a fatigue jacket and was left-handed. The gunman fled the scene carrying the .44 in his left hand and appeared to have worn a fatigue jacket. The OSI source also reported that Carr wasn't despondent before his death, which pointed to murder. had expressed a passing interest in witchcraft and that his brother Michael counseled people in Scientology. On the night of the 20th, Jim and I staked out the Yonkers funeral home where Carr was being waked. Writing down license plate numbers unknown to us, the sheriff's department was doing the same thing. We probably flagged the plate numbers of an official car or two. Fortunately, the rest of the media missed the death notice, and at 6 p.m. on February 21st, Midigar and I sat at adjacent typewriters in the Post City room to pound out the copy for the next day's editions. But something happened along the way. Somehow, the probable homicide turned into an apparent suicide as Dakota officials suddenly steered our inquiries away from murder. Midigar and I fought to keep the muddled circumstances intact in the story, but were overruled. We also knew that Minot authorities had received calls from Westchester Sheriff's investigators, the Yonkers Police, and Brooklyn DA's office and 10th Homicide, where our recent visits were clearly remembered. The closed 44 case was ajar after all. However, those deaths were also edited from the story, as was a sidebar piece that raised other questions about the Son of Sam case, including the contradictions at the Moskowitz scene. The Post was jittery and chose extreme caution, especially since a call to the DA's office produced a comment that Gold's people tended to discount any connection between Carr's death and the 44 case. That was a fallacy, and we knew it. But we lost a concerted battle to publish a comprehensive story. On Wednesday, February 22nd, the compromised version of the article appeared on page 1 under the headline, "Son of Sam Kills Himself." To our dismay, the death was called a suicide, the result of last-minute editing after Midigar and I left the paper. The story reported that Carr left North Dakota in late January and drove to New York, telling Minot friends he wouldn't be back for months. Like us, he was unaware that authorities, because of our initiative, were now interested in locating him. But then, said Ward County, North Dakota Sheriff's Lieutenant Terry Gardner, he suddenly changed his mind and flew back here. We don't know why. We don't know what went on in New York. Carr was in Yonkers for just 10 days before leaving his Mercury behind and flying into Minot in the early evening hours of Tuesday, February 14th. 2 nights later, he was dead. Carr's skull was demolished by a bullet into his mouth from a .30 Marlin rifle the night of the 16th in Miss O'Connor's home while she was out for the evening, the story said. The rifle, which was owned by Linda's husband, belonged in the house. It was found lying in a peculiar position on top of the dead man's leg. No suicide note was written. The article described the John Wheaties alias in the Breslin letter and compared it to the John Wheat Carr listing in the Westchester telephone directory. The story also mentioned that official sources in New York City discounted any link between Carr and Berkowitz, but Gardner was quoted as saying, "If I were them, I'd be interested in that angle, but that's not my jurisdiction. Our own investigation is completed." No, it wasn't. Gardner deliberately played with the truth, but it would be 18 months before I'd learn why he did so. That night, with the story on the streets, I watched the early evening newscasts, which reported the information as it appeared in the Post later. I joined Tom Bartley, his wife Madeline, and other friends for a Westchester nightclub performance by The Drifters, a well-known rock group of the late 50s and early 60s. Our table was festive, my date enjoyable, and even Bartley had praise for the work done on John Carr. You may really have something here after all, he said. I arrived home only to be awakened by a 7 a.m. phone call from Midigar's wife, Carol. She was close to tears. "Where were you?" she asked. I was trying to get you until 3 this morning. There's big trouble. Take it easy, Carol. Tell me what's up. I soothed, still weary from the night celebration. Carol broke down and began sobbing. Jim's been arrested, she cried. Suddenly, I was wide awake, not 9 hours after the car story appeared, and while I was out singing under the boardwalk with a gathering of friends, Jim was hustled off to jail and charged with bribery of a guard in the Sam Sleeps photo epic. The investigation was conducted by the Department of Correction and the State Special Prosecutor's Office, which was mandated to root out corruption in official agencies. The timing of the arrest was highly suspicious, although authorities said the indictment was secured some days before. Still, it wasn't acted on until the article was published in the Post. In effect, Midigar was removed from the conspiracy probe, and his reputation and credibility were tarnished by the charges, which carried a possible prison term up to 7 years. He was held overnight in a Manhattan jail before being arraigned and released on his own recognizance pending a trial. Hearing the numbing news from Carol, who at this time didn't know if or when Jim would be freed, I was speechless. The mercurial emotions of the last 13 days, beginning with the discovery of John Carr's auto on February 11th, had finally taken their toll. I hung up the phone immobilized, not knowing where to turn or what to do. At the same time, officials in New York City and Westchester were pointedly denying the relevance of the Post article and privately castigating the paper for speculative reporting. The story was dead in a day. The rest of the media reported the denials, and the Post, stung by the reaction, would back away from the conspiracy hunt and not venture forth again, even though information I uncovered that day showed Carr was being sought for questioning by New York authorities at the time of his death. After several hours, I summoned the presence of mind to call Peter Michaelmore at the Post. I told him of the arrest, which he already knew about, and informed him that I just learned New York authorities had wanted to question Carr. Michaelmore wasn't interested. We got blasted by every cop and prosecutor in town for running that story, he said. I think we're right. You think we're right, and Dunleavy thinks we're right, but they've pulled the rug out from under us. We've got nowhere to go on this anymore. It's over. And what about Jim? I asked. You had him at Kings County, me up here, and you people were coordinating the whole thing. I never wanted those damn pictures to run, Peter. I swore it would cut us off from Berkowitz, and it sure did that. And now Jim's in goddamn jail over it. Michaelmore was sympathetic but unmoved. Jim wasn't working for us. He was working for himself. As a freelance reporter, he supplied information and was paid for it. I realized what Michaelmore was saying. So you're cutting yourselves off from him? No legal assistance? No standing behind him? I'm sorry about it, but he was working for himself. We didn't know anything about any arrangements between him and this guard. I find that a little difficult to believe, Peter. Well, that's the way it was, and that's all there is to say about it. And what about the son of Sam and Carr? Like I said, we're dead in the water. They got us good on that story, and so the conversation ended. Later in a day, Midigar vehemently denied that the Post was unaware his source was a Department of Correction guard. They knew all along. They even supplied the spy camera used to take those damn pictures. I told the photo editor to present the damn thing because the guy taking the pictures was an amateur and wouldn't know how to work it otherwise. I was ignorant of any financial agreements between Midigar and the Post, or between Midigar and the guard. Money was a subject we never discussed. In fact, it was mid-January, 6 weeks after the photos were published, before Midigar even told me a guard had taken them. He didn't offer any other details, nor would I have expected him to do so. I did learn, however, that the reason it took so long to receive Berkowitz's replies to my question was that the guard, Herb Clark, had only sporadic access to the alleged .44 caliber killer. They got along well, Midigar explained, and Clark would often be in Berkowitz's area and say hello and all. But he needed to be alone with him to get the questions answered. That's why it took so long. In fact, Clark's inability to sit with Berkowitz more often set the stage for Midigar's apprehension. Jim asked if Clark knew a guard who had more access to Berkowitz, and Clark recommended Frank Jost. Midigar met with Jost in a Staten Island restaurant and told him he was hopeful Berkowitz could be enticed to unravel the conspiracy. He asked if Jost would deal with Berkowitz and get the information out. Jost reported the conversation to his superiors. At the same time, authorities had become suspicious of Clark and confronted him. Clark was then offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony against Midigar. With his permission, Clark's phone was then tapped, and officials monitored his conversations with Midigar. Among them were comments Jim made about the Carr case before the Post article appeared, which included information he'd gleaned from the OSI source in North Dakota. Why would they give immunity to a civil employee, a guard who did act improperly? To go after a writer is something I'll never understand, Midigar said. He insisted he was advised by the Post that his work was within the law. He prepared to mount a defense based on the connection that he acted as an agent of the paper in dealing with Clark and was made a scapegoat, singled out for selective prosecution. I never thought of it as bribery, he said. I was after a story and trying to help crack this case open if I could. I told Clark, and it was on their tapes, that I knew I wasn't doing anything illegal, and I hoped he was sure he was covered in that respect. Midigar said the photos, which had no connection to the conspiracy probe, were taken at the urging of both Clark and the Post. Clark wanted money, so he pushed for the pictures, and the Post wanted them too. I was in the middle of it. I did want a full-time job at the Post, and I was trying to earn a living. The money from the pictures did help me out there. With the Posts out of the picture, so to speak, Midigar under indictment and the John Carr link officially denied. I was left without a partner, a suspect, or a public forum. I continued some half-hearted work on the case, specifically on Michael Carr, but my main preoccupation was with the fatal reversal of fortune. It was almost as if John Carr never existed, but he did. John Charles Carr was born in Yonkers on October 12, 1946. He shared a birthday with the notorious black magician and occultist Aleister Crowley. Carr attended Holy Rosary Grammar School in Yonkers, spent 1 year at a Catholic high school there, and then graduated from Gorton High. He apparently enrolled at an upstate New York college but left to join the Air Force, where he remained a dozen years. He was discharged, allegedly for drug and disciplinary reasons. On October 13, 1976, the day after his 30th birthday, Carr had been stationed in Thailand, Korea, and Panama City, Florida, before transferring to the large Strategic Air Command SAC base outside Minot in the summer of 1972. His military specialty was aircraft maintenance, and at Minot he was assigned to the 5th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, performing mechanical work on the F-106. He took some courses including accounting and psychology at Minot State College while in the military, and was a staff sergeant at the time of his discharge. After leaving the service, Carr shuttled back and forth between Minot and Yonkers. Authorities placed him in the New York area at the time of at least 4 and probably 5 Son of Sam attacks, including the Lomino de Masi shooting, whose composite he closely resembled. He was also in New York at the time of the Christine Freund homicide in January 1977 and the shooting outside the Alifas Discoith on June 26th of that year. He also was believed to have been in New York at the time of the Donna Lauria murder in July 1976 and that of Stacy Moskowitz on July 31st, 1977. Carr was married and divorced by 1974 and had a daughter who was 5 years old at the time of his death. Her name and that of her mother's will be withheld here out of respect for their privacy. Friends dated Carr's deteriorating slide to the aftermath of the divorce. Carr's ex-wife remarried and moved to Beaumont, Texas, near Houston, the site of the .44 caliber purchase. Carr was known to visit that area, and his brother Michael told Linda O'Connor that John was in Houston on June 12, 1976, the day Berkowitz obtained his .44 Bulldog. Carr, police said, was a moderate to heavy user of marijuana and psychedelic drugs, and he was hospitalized on 3 occasions in 1976 and 77 for drug overdoses. Police also stated that Carr dealt drugs in Minot and perhaps in New York, an assertion supported by several of his friends who admitted buying narcotics from him on a regular basis. He was also a heavy drinker, a fact which I'd later learn was known by Berkowitz, who considered himself unstable and a weak link. In the months preceding his death, Carr received drug therapy and underwent psychiatric counseling as well. A bottle of Haldol, oh God, they tried giving that shit to me, a powerful prescription drug used to treat psychiatric disorders, was found in the O'Connor home in Minot. It was Carr's medicine. Yeah, well, I'm a paraplegic, and I went to the ER screaming in pain and asking for my normal medication, which was Dilaudid, which is a pretty epic opiate. So, understandably, but he's like, no, I think you're crazy. I'm going to give you Haldol. And I said, I'm leaving. In several months before his death, he was on the move. He was in New York for several weeks in June 1977, where, among other things, he attended a circus with a Long Island friend. He returned to Minot, traveled to Austin, Texas, for unknown reasons in mid-July, and apparently was back in New York at the end of the month. He arrived in North Dakota just before Berkowitz's arrest on August 10th, when he made that "oh shit" comment as news of the capture flashed on the TV screen. In December 1977, Carr left Minot and traveled to the Houston area, where he dropped in to see his daughter in Beaumont. His ex-wife told us it was the first time she'd seen him in several years. Although he'd been in Houston in the recent past, returning to Minot, he decided to leave for New York again in late January. He packed some belongings in the 71 Mercury, which was registered to the Carr home in Yonkers, not North Dakota, which made tracing the plate futile, and departed from New York on January 31st. It is certain he didn't know he was now being sought for questioning. On February 10th, he sent a Valentine's card to Linda O'Connor and conducted a lengthy phone conversation with her the night of the 11th, several hours after I spotted his car. I would later learn that during this conversation with Linda, he said the cops were hot on his trail and he'd have to leave New York for a while. He told Linda he'd contact her soon. On February 14th, leaving his car behind, he unexpectedly flew to Minot, and he died 48 hours later. He hadn't planned to return to Minot for months. John Carr was running. The information we uncovered convinced us Carr was involved with Berkowitz, But there was nothing we could do. The authorities in New York had shut us down. I finally called Sal Diorio at the sheriff's department and was told there are indications of cult activity in Berkowitz's neighborhood, but we can't prove it. This was a strong comment supporting what I'd been working toward all along. But Diorio offered no specific information and revealed nothing about the death of John Carr, although I'd later learned there was a lot of data in hand. I also tried to elicit cooperation from North Dakota authorities, but was rebuffed there as well. With nowhere to turn, I delved heavily into my corporate job, hoping to hide my frustrations in the pages of the magazine I edited. But the case was gnawing at me, and I commiserated weekly with friends at Oliver's in White Plains, where the bartenders also chimed in with suggestions and bits of information they'd picked up. Ironically, two of them, Dave Spence and Steve Sturrs, were friends of Norman Bing. The young supervisor, Fred Cowan, was gunning for when he terrorized the Neptune warehouse in New Rochelle the year before. Bing, who was in frail health, escaped injury by hiding under the desk that endless day, but his condition had steadily deteriorated since he appeared at the bar on occasion, a shadow of his former self. He'd die several years later, effectively the final victim of neo-Nazi friend Cowan. But despite some encouragement at Oliver's during the dreary late winter of 1978, it was starkly evident that most people wanted to believe Berkowitz had acted alone. The dread was still very much alive. In mid-April, I began dating an attractive brunette secretary named Georgina G., a former Queens resident. At 24, she'd been affected by the fear that engulfed New York's women a year earlier, and to my surprise, she expressed interest in the later developments. It was a welcome change from the setbacks and blank stares Jim and I often endured. On our first evening together, we went to dinner at Thwaites Restaurant on City Island in the Bronx, a quaint finger of land on the edge of Long Island Sound, which harbored marinas, bait and tackle shops, and a number of excellent seafood establishments. On the way back, I realized it was the first anniversary of the Serrani Esau murders, and we drove to that scene and to that of Donna Loria's death a few blocks to the east. I pulled into the same darkened spot on the service road where Valentina and Alex parked, and explained what had happened that night. Rather than feeling fright, G was inquisitive and struck by a somber reverence. The narrow street was deserted, and the dim light from a distant street lamp flickered in the haze as we talked. 1 year ago tonight, I said quietly, and in the next instant they were gone. What's that song out now? Dust in the Wind? I close my eyes, only for a moment, and that moment's gone, she recited. Yes, that's it. And who's here in that place exactly 1 year later, and up to his damned neck in all of it? I never would have believed it. I used to live a normal life, and now Berkowitz is only a couple of weeks from taking the fall for everything. It's almost finished. Dust in the Wind. It's not over for you yet, G replied. I think you know that. I don't think I make a very good Don Quixote? Never heard of that guy, I answered. I have an aversion to windmills. Don't you think you owe it to yourself, to Jim, and maybe to the victims who died here, she asked. For a long time we sat in silence. 1,000 images of that shooting and the past 8 months spun in my mind. Nothing was clear. There were only fractured flashes of myriad events. I just don't know anymore, I finally said. I simply just don't know. Let's get out of here now. We paid our respects. You haven't finished paying yours yet, she remarked. Not by a long shot. The words just hung in the air. Starting the engine, I pulled from the haunting parking spot and drove back to White Plains, nudging the speed limit all the way. A week later, the hammer fell again as my close friend Ben Carucci died at 44. He and his wife Lee were opening their summer home when death struck. I was deeply saddened by the loss and observed from a distant daze as Berkowitz prepared to plead guilty. In a final gesture, I phoned one of his attorneys, Leon Stern, and urged him to confront Berkowitz with the evidence we'd found. A few days later, Stern's associate, Ira Jultak, advised me Berkowitz refused to answer any of my questions. We're interested in John Carr and Michael too, Jultak told me, but we're getting no cooperation at all from our client. The way was finally cleared. There was no options left, and on May 8th, Berkowitz stoically entered guilty pleas in Brooklyn before a panel of 3 judges, one from each borough in which shootings occurred. In a courtroom jammed with spectators, press, and victims' families, I couldn't bring myself to attend, but Jim, rousing himself from his own adversity, covered the session for us. It was, as many noted, a carefully programmed event. No trick or probing questions were put to Berkowitz. His answers were mainly yes and no responses, stipulating that he indeed committed all the crimes, and then it was over. With summer on the horizon, I retreated to Fire Island for 3 weeks in July to decide what to do in the future. Our friends were also there. Along with the socializing, I spent several hours discussing the case with Carl Kelly, an NYPD officer. He wasn't surprised that the evidence as we knew it was disregarded, and was concerned that the case would eventually tarnish the whole of the NYPD. The information flowed upward, he said. There were only a few people at the top who had access to all the details. This case is a hornet's nest, he added, indicating the folders he'd read. It was so big they didn't dare admit they might have screwed it up. A lot of cops would be ticked off to know all this was allowed to go on. The precious system strikes again, I responded bitterly, and Mr. District Attorney Eugene Gold is one of its main components. Those people aren't going to like you guys at all if you keep on with this guy, Carl warned. So what else is new? Midigar might end up in prison as it is. And it was through the beleaguered Midigar that the initial upswing would come. At the end of July, Jim sent word to the beach that Alan Walper, a columnist for the Soho Weekly News in Manhattan, had expressed interest in the post-bribery case. The photo thing goes hand in hand with the conspiracy angle, Jim explained when I phoned him from the dock. I'll tell Walper about all of it, and if he decides to write it up, maybe both stories can come out. For the first time since late February, a wisp of optimism drifted in the air. Alan Walper was indeed interested in the photo case and said that he'd referenced the search for accomplices in that context. He subsequently devoted numerous columns to the saga of Sam Sleeps, wondering aloud why the Post escaped the indictment. And, true to his word, he cautiously raised the conspiracy flag. Finally, someone was listening. Buoyed by the positive turn, Jim and I sought out several principals in the 44 case, including key Brooklyn witness Tommy Ziano, who observed the Moskowitz Violante attack from his borrowed blue Corvette. Ziano's statements added more optimism. We were now convinced that Berkowitz wasn't alone that night, and almost certain he didn't shoot the young couple either. Ziano also revealed that the 10th homicide detective Ed Zigo asked him not to talk to us. which only sparked Ziono's curiosity because he had remained inwardly troubled by the police assertion that the long-haired man he saw pulled the trigger was Berkowitz. It was Ziono who was told by police that Berkowitz might have drenched his short, curly hair with water to make it appear long and straight. Did they say he carried a garden hose with him, or did he just duck under the hydrant he was parked at? Jim asked incredulously. Hey, I didn't buy that either, Ziono said. After hearing Ziono's account, which hadn't reached the public, it wasn't difficult to see why Zigo, who knew us from the meeting at the 10th months before, tried to discourage him from cooperating. Meanwhile, another important event was dawning on the legal front. After his arrest, the financially strapped Midigar secured the services of attorney Felix Gilroy, head of Staten Island's Legal Aid Society. Gilroy, an affable, quick-witted lawyer in his late 30s, listened intently as Jim filled him in on both the bribery case and the Son of Sam investigation. In due course, he came to believe that Berkowitz was part of a conspiracy. During one brainstorming session among the three of us, the groundwork was laid for a unique legal strategy. Since bribery was often considered a crime of intent, it was reasonable to seek since bribery was often considered a crime of intent, it was reasonable to seek to establish that Midigar's intentions were above board. It would also be beneficial to find a witness who could shed some light on the intrigue at Kings County Hospital. Gilroy then filed a motion before State Supreme Court Justice Ernst Rosenberg in Brooklyn in early October. He received the judge's ruling and called to tell me what it was. Pack your bags and questions, he said. We're going to meet the Son of Sam. Wow, finally a short chapter. My goodness.